Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd like to start by making a request. If possible, I'd love for people in the back to come up a little bit closer. I need to be, yes, please do. Everybody who can, who is comfortable, please come up. Because ultimately, yes, I will talk, but I really want to have discussion with you. Okay, and it's easier for me to feel your reaction if I can see you. All right, good. If you don't know, my name is Larry Appelbaum. I do a number of things in the United States. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm a senior music specialist at the Library of Congress. They're jazz specialists. I also have a radio program. I've been doing radio in Washington for 31 years. And I write for various magazines and websites all over the world, especially Jazz Times. I do a lot of other things, but we don't need to discuss that right now outside the jazz sphere. But for today, I hope it's okay that I'm speaking in English. Everybody's cool with that. Thank you. Because I can barely speak English. I want to talk to you today not about jazz history. You all know that. You can read any book to tell you context for who these major figures are, why they're important. The past has been documented. What I want to talk about a little bit today is what's happening today. In the music itself, the aesthetics, the audience, the business, and the industry, and how all these things commingle and overlap. So I will begin by telling you how I became interested in jazz. I was a singer. I had studied voice, mostly classical. Actually, I'd studied everything that involved vocal harmony, which is what I love. And I particularly enjoyed singing Bach chorales. I'm a baritone. And I thought Johann Sebastian Bach wrote the most beautiful bass lines. He wrote beautiful melodies, he wrote beautiful harmonies, he wrote beautiful everything. But I loved his bass lines. And when I heard certain bass players, for example, there's a man named Ray Brown. Anybody know that name? Ray Brown? One of the all-time great acoustic bass players. He used to be on a television orchestra, some talk show, the Merv Griffin show. And he was in the band behind Merv. I used to watch that show every night just to see Ray Brown. Because sometimes they'd, coming out of commercial or during the break, you would hear him playing his bass. And for me, I made an immediate connection between Ray Brown's walking bass style and the bass lines of Johann Sebastian Bach. They were both swinging, but in a very different way, very distinctive way. But they were both using counterpoint. They were both using voice leading. They were both doing similar kinds of things, but for their own age, for their own time period. So I began to say, oh, I sort of like this stuff. What is this called? Oh, this is jazz. Okay, I get it. And then when I was about 14 or 15 years old, my choral teacher used to tell me, hey, you've got a good voice, good intonation, your diction's fine, all that other stuff, but your time sucks, meaning my time. I didn't have my rhythm together, right? Maybe we can all identify with that at some point. He told me to listen to Count Basie if I want to figure out what it means play together, to really feel the beat as one. And in the case of Count Basie, it's like 15 players all feeling that beat together and doing it in a very advanced way, very advanced swing. So I said, Count Basie, okay, that's kind of a cool name. I had never really heard him, never paid any attention. So I found out that he was going to be playing at the University of Maryland, and I went, bought a ticket, arrived that night. It was sold out. There were no seats left. So I was so disappointed, and finally the person at the entrance said, well, if you don't mind, you can sit in front of the front row. If you're willing to sit on the floor, right in front of the band, be our guest. So I did. Great, here's my chance. So I sat down there, and literally, the band was right here on this stage, and I was sitting like right here, right in front of the band. Totally unprepared for what I was about to hear, because they just exploded right in my face. That was the most swinging band I had ever, it's the most swinging thing I had ever heard in my life. The precision, the passion, the power, and more importantly, the fact that they played time together. And I kept listening to this guitarist, this rhythm guitarist in Count Basie's band. His name was Freddie Green. That was the thing, because he held everything together. That was the glue that held the rhythm section together, and it's the rhythm section that held the band together. So Freddie Green, I never ever saw him play a solo. He never played single note stuff. Do we have any guitarists here? No? Do you know Freddie Green?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All he did was play 4 to the bar chords. Dun, 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 with interesting little inversions. It wasn't about the notes he was playing. It was about the feeling he was playing with. Super steady. And everybody in the band was listening to the rhythm guitarist. Now these days, nobody plays rhythm guitar. Not really. Certainly not in a big band. You'll have a lead guitarist. But that whole art of playing rhythm guitar, it's gone. Nobody does that. I mean, occasionally you'll find an older person like Bucky Pizzarelli can still play rhythm guitar. Mostly the guys coming out of the swing era can still play swing guitar. But it's a generational thing. It's almost all lost and all gone. But I encourage anybody who likes or listens to Count Basie, listen for that rhythm. Not just in the band, but listen for Freddie Green, because that's the thing that holds everything together. It was a profound lesson for me. It changed the whole idea I have of what it means to play together. They would play a song like Little Darlin', which is a ballad, with lots of space between the notes, and yet it was so together. It's just remarkable. I didn't know how they could do that. I mean, I'm breathing, and as I'm listening, my breathing becomes rhythmic. Yes? My heart starts to mimic the sound of the band, the beat that the band is playing. So it's fairly easy to get caught up in the swing when you're playing fast tempo, but when you're playing a ballad and still feeling that, feeling the energy in between the notes, it's stunning when it works. And when it doesn't work, it's deadly. It's just disaster if you don't have it together. It just sounds like chaos, blah, blah. But when you have a rhythm section like that, well, that was a profound lesson for me. It changed the whole way I thought about jazz. I began to say, yeah, this is what I want to learn about. And when I say learn about it, I don't mean just reading a magazine article. I don't mean just buying a record and sitting home and listening to it. I mean diving into the waters and swimming, really immersing yourself in that water. And that's really what it takes if you want to dedicate yourself to a life of music and certainly to a life of jazz. It's not about going to your classes and doing well. You might get a top grade, a top score in your class. That's fine, that's great. You can learn a lot in a classroom. You really can. And if you've got a good teacher, it makes things so much easier. But that's just the beginning. That's just lessons from school. And I can tell you that some of the most important lessons you will have in this life are not from the classroom. It's what you learn on the bandstand. It's what you learn on the bus traveling between cities. It's what you learn hanging out with musicians who are older than you and passing on this information. because in many respects, much music, certainly folk music, and I think jazz, is still an oral tradition. You might have a large bookshelf with many titles about jazz. I mean, I have one of those bookshelves. I have two of those bookshelves. I have hundreds of these books. And where I work at the Library of Congress, we have millions of these books about music. And you can learn a lot from reading them. But again, that's only a small sort of sliver of what this music is really about. It's not about the notes that you play, although you better have the notes together. It's not about technique, although it really helps to have your technique together. What is it really about? From my perspective, it's really about what's inside. Inside your heart, inside your head, inside your feet, whatever it is you are trying to express. It comes from within. You're expressing it externally, and the most important part is you're connecting with people. Without that connection, forget it. You're just playing for yourself. You might as well be playing at home, music -1, playing to records, which is actually not a bad exercise. But what this life of a musician is about is connection. Connecting to people on a very human level, and you can do it in such a way that you produce and evoke joy. Because that's what I felt when I was listening to Count Basie that day. 15 years old, watching Freddie Green, just wide-eyed, just with my jaw. It was joy. And that's the thing that stayed with me my entire life. And that's the thing that keeps me going, is joy. And that's what you can share, your joy, with your audience. And that, to me, is what the life of a musician is really about. Okay, that's enough introduction about me. I want to talk a little bit today about the fact that everything changes in this world. There's some things that are constant. For example, creativity. There have always been creative people in every age, in every style of music, in every style of art, in every genre, in every area of human development. There is creativity. So that's a constant. But it's the way when creative musicians, who usually think of themselves as artists, when artists intersect with the world of commerce and business, that's where the sparks start to fly. And that's where there are inspiring stories and tragedies. And so one of the most important points I can make today is that, yes, develop yourselves as artists. Learn who you are and how to express that and connect with people that you're with, that you're performing with and that you're playing for. But you should also learn something about the world around you, because you're not sitting in an ivory tower in a music school. I mean, once you get out of school, you're in the real world. You're going to have to find a way to make a living. I'm not going to tell you how to make the living. Everybody has to arrive at that conclusion themselves. But I can say it will help you infinitely if you want to make any kind of money and support yourself. You need to understand something about the world of business. So yes, learn your instrument. Yes, learn about music. Yes, learn about context. Yes, learn about the world around you. But learn something about business. Learn how to read a contract. The history of this music is littered with stories of people who didn't read their contract and they got screwed. They got screwed out of their royalties. They got screwed out of their publishing. They died broke when they didn't need to, while somebody else made money off of them, while someone else exploited them. So one way you can protect yourself is by learning something about the world of sharks. I don't know if you like animals, especially animals of the sea. A shark can be very sort of friendly and peaceful, or a shark can be deadly. Same thing in the music business. There are nice, friendly people who care about artists. And then there's the other kind. There's some really dangerous people out there, and you need to learn how to protect yourself. So, for example, again, I know nothing about the situation here in Estonia. I'd like to know more, actually. I'm very curious how, for example, copyright works here in Estonia. But I would say that your first step, if you want to learn something about that, is to read a book about the business of music, and maybe more than one book, because the business changes all the time. If I read a book about the business of music that was written 8 or 9 years ago, forget it. It's almost not relevant anymore. There's some basic things you can learn, but the world has changed. The ground has shifted. So you really need to be up to date about the changes in copyright law. You need to understand what it means to set up your own publishing, because that's where the money is. Ask yourself this question: who owns the music? Who owns the music that you love? The chances are it's not the artist. If the artist is really smart, they will set up their own publishing and their own company to protect their own intellectual property. But I hate to say it, there are far too many artists who are not that smart. And as I say, the world is full of sharks. They know exactly how to set up publishing and copyrights. So that, let's say you make a record and somehow your record becomes a hit. It's played a lot on the radio. You start appearing on television. You start appearing outside of Estonia at various festivals. And the golden moment is if your song gets used in a motion picture or on a television commercial or somehow gets reused and republished. There's a lot of money in that. And if you haven't set up your publishing, if you haven't created your business enterprise that knows how to protect your intellectual property, you're not going to get any of that money. They'll take it all from you. So I'm not saying everybody here is going to start making film soundtracks and get your music heard. But it really does help to understand how the business works, so you protect yourself. Because so much of what I've been thinking about lately has to do with the fact that musicians and artists need to be more self-reliant and to be more responsible to themselves. And what I mean by that is, this is one of the big changes from old school days. When, oh, I'm a musician. All I do is make music. And some record label comes and signs me, makes me sign a 7-year contract, starts putting out, they pay for my studio costs, they pay for the producer, they pay for the pressing plant, they pay for all this stuff. It's nonsense. Look at your contract. You're paying for all of that. You won't get a dime. You won't get a single euro of royalties until that's been recovered. All those expenses, not only to make the record, the CD, whatever it is, or the cost to promote it, which can be significant. So the record label may send out 1,000 copies to various journalists, either here in this country or around the world. Journalists, gatekeepers, assignment editors, bloggers, radio hosts, etc. They may have 1,500 or 2,000 promotional CDs that they send out. They're pressed, they create a press release, they package it, and they send it out to all these gatekeepers. Who do you think's paying for all that? You guys. The artist pays for all that, and they don't even realize it until they're saying, hey, we're selling all these records. How come I don't have royalties? Where are my royalties? And the record label says, read your contract. And by then it's too late. You've already signed it. They've already made the money. They've already sent it out. And you're paying for everything. So that's a bit of a cautionary tale. And the more you understand and know and appreciate about the business of music, the more you're able to protect yourself, your intellectual property, your interests, because it's your life. So my point about being self-reliant, yes, that certainly affects your position in the world, in the music business. But it extends even beyond that. For example, I'm fortunate in that I get to travel a lot. And certain places I travel, I notice that musicians have taken great initiative to create their own opportunities. We would use a word called hustle. Do you know this word, to hustle? No? What would be the Estonian word for hustle? Anybody knows? No? Okay. I'll accept that. It means you don't lay back and wait for somebody else to do it for you. We have this movement in the United States called DIY. Do it yourself. Do it yourself. What that means is you can have more control over your music, over your creative works, over your career, if you're willing to hustle. If you know how to write a press release, if you're willing to go out and contact club owners or festivals or record labels, if you are willing to hustle and create your own gigs, that's a big deal. There's a big difference between people who lay back and wait for the world to come to them and the people who go out and find the gigs. I can't tell you how many people I know who are, I'll try to be polite, I know there's a camera right there. People who are not the greatest musicians, but they do very well in the music business because they're organized, because they are disciplined, because they are willing to hustle. Likewise, I know quite a few people who are excellent musicians, highly creative, maybe even visionary, and their careers go nowhere because they show up late to gigs or not at all. They haven't set up their publishing. They're not willing to make the least effort to send their stuff out, to promote themselves. I mean, we're living in the world of social media. I assume everybody at least has a Facebook page, or maybe some of you use Twitter or whatever. Some people, I can't tell you how many musicians, really good musicians, and I say, how do you make the announcements of your gigs? They're always complaining, oh, nobody showed up. I didn't make any money. Well, what did you do to promote your gig? I showed up. They showed up for the gig. They thought it was somebody else's responsibility, the club, for example. Well, the club, they blame the club for everything. I said, come on, that's like old school thinking. That's not where it's at these days. You really need, if you're not willing to go on Facebook, find some young kid to set up a Facebook page for you and start sending your announcements out. Get as many friends as you can to like your page or however you want to do it, and start sending this stuff out. Create a blog if you're willing to, or have somebody do it for you, and start sharing your personal ideas, your personal experiences, because so much of building an audience has to do with having this connection. For your audience to feel they know who you are. They understand, if you're writing dispatches from the road, oh, I'm in Estonia now, I'm in Tartu, I'm talking to students, they'll start to identify with you and go along on your journey with you. They'll feel like they know you, so that when you come to their town, they'll show up. They really do feel a connection that way. That's the best thing about social media. I'm very tired of cute photos of kittens, and snarky comments and all that other stuff. Lists. Oh, I love lists. I call them listicles. So yes, Facebook is annoying. Yes, Facebook can be an incredible waste of time. But it can be a very effective tool to get your word out, to help develop your audience, and to get your audience to feel a connection with you and your work. You can even start to give away free MP3s. That's audience development. These are things that a record label used to do for you in the past. And they don't lift a finger anymore. They just don't. I mean, don't expect it. You have to do these things for yourself, or at least be willing to. And the more you are willing to hustle, I think the more successful you will be. That has nothing to do with your skill or your talent. That just tells me something about how much do you want this? How much do you want to be a success? How much do you want to make a living as a musician? How much do you want to tour? How many festivals do you want to appear at? You can get all of these things if you're willing to work hard, really hard, and be dedicated. The other thing is you never stop learning. Don't ever get to the point where you feel like, yeah, I've made it. You've never made it. Nobody ever has made it, no matter how much money they make. I don't know how many of you are planning to go see Pat Metheny. He's appearing in Tallinn on Sunday. Or I could name many other examples. Well, Pat Metheny's been out there for decades. I mean, he was actually the very first person I ever interviewed in like 1976. And he was a kid at the time, and so was I. We're about the same age. It was so funny, I'll tell you this. Yeah, leave it there. So I'm assigned by the radio station to go interview Pat Metheny. Okay, so Pat Metheny, are you kidding me? He's like this great guitarist, and who am I? And I had never interviewed somebody. So what do you do? How do you interview somebody? I don't know. So this was before internet, right? You have to remember, I'm an analog guy. I'm a dinosaur. So this is before internet. So I looked in a book of interviews, and I said, oh, you ask these questions, and maybe you ask a follow-up question, right? So I say, yeah, I got it now. I'm going to go interview Pat Metheny. So I show up, and I've been really thinking about good questions, tough questions, to get him to really respond. So I ask him these good questions, these tough questions. And he starts giving me interesting answers, and I'm thinking to myself, yeah, this is not so hard, right? And then at one point, Pat looks down, and he says, your tape recorder is still in pause. So that's like a life lesson right there. Forget about the ego stuff. Forget about thinking that you're hot. I was going to say something, but hot stuff. And realize you're there to be a professional. And being professional means you have your stuff together. It means if you have a tape recorder, do you have fresh batteries in there? Do you have plenty of tape in case he goes long and your tape runs out? Or did you remember to listen when you hear the click so you can flip the tape over? Again, this is before MP3 recorders, right? So you had basically 45 minutes on each side of the tape. So that was a life lesson for my profession. And Pat was cool about the whole thing. He just said, oh, by the way, you're still in pause. And I was embarrassed. I was really embarrassed. But he was cool, so I just took it out of pause. We're rolling. We just resumed. I didn't go back to the beginning. We just resumed, and he gave me a great interview. Because he saw something, I guess he saw something in me, that I was sincere. And that's the thing that musicians really zero in on. If somebody comes up to a musician, maybe you've been in this situation. Maybe you've performed, and somebody young comes up to you, and they look at you all adoring, like you're some great hero. Well, not at all. I mean, maybe you are, and maybe that's good for your ego. But forget about all that stuff. It's person to person. On one level, it's just another human being that heard something or was touched by something you did. So talk to them about it. This is how you can talk to journalists. I could do a whole seminar on interviewing and how to deal with journalists. But I'm already a little far afield. Let me go back to my initial point, which is that things are changing. The business has changed. The fact that you used to be signed to a record label and they would take care of everything, that's changed. It's the same if you're in the top 1%. If you're Esperanza Spalding, or Jason Moran, or Diana Krall, or Keith Jarrett, or Nora Jones, yes, you can sit back and the world will come to you. And they'll offer you lots of money to do whatever that you want. But you're not Keith Jarrett. I'm sorry. Not yet. Maybe someday you will be. But we, all of us, none of us are in the top 1%. That means we have to hustle. We need to take some initiative, and we need to do some things. So the other major sea change, as I see it, is that young people, and that's a relative term, but let's say people under the age of 30, 35, they don't want to pay for music. They don't think they should have to pay for music. They don't feel any obligation. They think music should be free. So, this is especially exacerbated with file sharing and how easy it is to do that. So if people under the age of 35 are not paying for music, I mean, some will actually pay 99 cents for a download, but most are not. Well, what does that mean for professional musicians who used to make their money on sales of physical media? They're really hurting now because of bootlegging or because nobody wants to pay for it. It's the attitude. It's not just CDs. It's any intellectual property. I mean, I work for the Library of Congress. I do a lot of reference work, so I work in the reading room. People come in all the time and they want access to information about music. And they think, first of all, that everything will be digitized and that it will be free. And in each case, you have to explain, oh, you have to understand there are 35 million items just in the music division of the Library of Congress. Nobody in the world has the money to pay 1,000 digital conversion specialists to scan everything. It's just not conceivable. The second thing is, we would love to make everything accessible to the world, put it up on our website. But there's something called intellectual property. And if you write a book, if any of you write a book and publish it, we're not allowed to put your book, the contents of your book, up on the website without your permission. These things happen all the time. People who have blogs put intellectual property up on the blogs that is illegal. And they just wait for somebody to come and sue them or tell them to take it down. Library of Congress is not allowed to do that because the United States Copyright Office is inside the Library of Congress. So we're very cool about copyright. Some countries are more cool than other countries about this. I would be very curious how Estonia is when it comes to respecting intellectual property. Okay, all that aside, let me say that the changes include the casual approach towards intellectual property and the fact that musicians are not making money off of their physical media, off of their recordings. The way they make their money is live appearances. It's just the opposite of what used to be. It used to be that people would tour and even lose money on a tour in order to sell their album or their CD. That's how they made their money, was the media. It's just the opposite. Now people just make the media, even though they're not going to make money off of it, in order to help them get more concerts, because that's where they make their money. And for an American musician, they really make their money coming over to Europe, where the euro is strong. And American musicians it's sort of a buyer's market. So I think those are two really important changes, is this attitude towards intellectual property and the fact that it's all about touring now. It's all about appearing if you want to make money. It's not about selling, except if you are Kenny G and then you put out a record every 5 years and you sell 7 million of them and you'll make some money. Is Kenny G here today with us? I don't think so. So be prepared for that you may not make much money from the sale of your CD. However, it is important to make that CD. It's your calling card. It will help you get more and more jobs. Plus, you can give them to your friends and family and whatever. Everybody will be so proud of you. So I think that there's something going on. By the way, how many of you, I know you're all sort of music students, is that right? Everybody here is in the music program here. How many of you actually play jazz? Let me see, show of hand. Everybody? Almost everybody. Okay. I'm very curious. If you don't mind, I'm going to start to ask you some questions. Where do you find out about jazz? What do you read? Or what do you listen to? Or is there radio? Or is there, do you look at YouTube? How do you find out about jazz?
First of all, I was born into a family of jazz musicians.
Oh, you were?
Lots came with the family.
Okay, here in Tartu? Okay.
Yeah. And second of all, my mom was a DJ in a jazz radio, so she has a great nose for finding out great stuff.
Okay.
Also, of course, social media, YouTube, everything. And what I love nowadays is when you look up an artist that you like, you get suggestions of other artists that are similar. So it's a whole world where you dive into, and you just get lost in there because you start looking up all these new artists, and it's.
And speaking of new artists, what have you been listening to lately?
Ooh, what a great question. My God, Sarah McFarlane is my latest.
Obsession.
New favorite singer.
Okay, good.
I like her simplicity.
Okay, good.
And well, before that my big number one was Dee Dee Bridgewater and Victoria Tolstoy. I'm a big fan of Scandinavian jazz and Nordic influences in music.
Okay.
So I like Swedish artists as well.
There's a lot happening also. You know this probably better than I do. There's a lot happening in Norway these days just because they have oil money. And they are able to subsidize their artists on a level that the Swedes used to, but don't have quite the money anymore to send their groups out into the world or to invite foreign journalists to come and sample their festivals. There used to be a Swedish jazz celebration every year that I used to go to, no more. I mean, but that's the intersection. We were talking about the intersection of music and business. That is the intersection of music and politics. And that has to do with how you want to allocate public resources towards the arts. That is also changing a great deal. In the United States, I mean, musicians look at Europe as a model for how to subsidize the arts. Now, some countries are much better and much stronger than other countries, but in general, Europe subsidizes arts on a much higher level than the United States. In the United States, it's mostly the marketplace. However, there are some private and public entities that will support and underwrite the arts. For example, there's a woman who she died very wealthy. Her name was Doris Duke. And her husband, her family was in the tobacco business. They made a fortune. Extraordinary. And she happened to like jazz. Well, actually, she liked jazz musicians. And so she has been giving money. She died, but her foundation has been awarding grants and basically handing musicians money either for projects or for achievement. And they just announced, just this week while I've been in Estonia, while I was in Tallinn, they announced the latest round of awards. And let me read you the list of people who received these awards, and I'm just curious how many of them you would even recognize. I'm not even sure most Americans would recognize these names. Oliver Lake. Anybody know him? He's a saxophonist. Craig Taborn. Zena Parkins. Steve Lehman. Roscoe Mitchell. Randy Weston. Muhal Richard Abrams. Ambrose Akinmusiri. Steve Coleman. Ben Monder, Matana Roberts, and Jen Hsu. Any light bulbs go off over your heads? Do you recognize any of those names?
I think Ben, what was it called?
Ben Monder.
Yeah, he came here.
He did? Really? He's an amazing guitar player. Guitarists, you know, just go crazy over him. But here's a point that's worth observing. Those names, I know every one of them, I know their music, but they are not popular artists. None of them are. So how did they get these big cash awards from the Doris Duke Foundation? They got it because they convened, the foundation convened a panel or several panels that would evaluate. What they generally do is they go out and they find certain people. It's all secretive process, right? This is not public, it's not transparent by any stretch. So they'll go out and they'll find what they consider certain gatekeepers, leading journalists or leading radio people or leading musicians, and they'll say, who do you think deserves this award this year? And they'll get a large group, you know, a sample, maybe they'll get 35 or 40 names, and then they'll convene a panel of what they consider the most important voices in jazz and say, take this list and boil it down to the top 10 names or top 12, whatever it might be. And that's how these are decided. This is not a popularity contest by any stretch. In fact, again, even people who know about jazz in the United States don't know half those names. It's the insiders, it's the gatekeepers who chose these names. It wasn't Doris Duke Foundation. They don't know anything about jazz necessarily. They got what they considered the insiders, the head of a music school, the head of a publishing company, you know, a leading player. And that's how they got these names. And these names get, I don't know, $20,000, $30,000 each, just free, just like, here you go. Award for achievement. Well, that's a big deal, but that almost never happens in the United States. The National Endowment for the Arts, which is a governmental agency that's meant to help subsidize the arts, they tend to give awards for individual projects. And if you know how to write like a grant application, using certain language that arts administrators love, they'll give you an award. This is very different from the way Norwegians, for example, might subsidize the arts. In Norway, they will actually give money to a venue that will then hire musicians throughout the year. In Norway, they might give you, an individual artist, some money, but it would be for a specific recording project or a touring opportunity or to help subsidize a tour overseas. So I used to book concerts in Washington, D.C., and I knew that if we booked Norwegian artists, it would cost us nothing because it came free to us. And that's one reason why the Norwegians have a great advantage throughout Europe. At least this was the case 2-3 years ago. Maybe some of my colleagues might have noticed a change since then. But there are many people, many Brits, for example, people in the UK, musicians in the UK, who are envious, jealous, and a little bit angry that they have to compete against musicians who are being subsidized by their government. Whereas the British Council used to underwrite them, but no more. So there's a disparity for how much public money is going into the arts, certainly in the United States, but it's even reaching Europe, where it used to be very safe. Artists did very well. If you were a Dutch artist, it didn't matter how many people you drew to your concert. They would give you money because they felt it was important to put money into the arts. That has all changed because of the intersection of art and politics. Not necessarily business, politics. So if you want to learn how to play the political game, please do. You may be able to get some of this money. This is your option. I know musicians who make their living just writing grants and getting grants from private foundations. That's how they do it. I know other musicians who make their money just coming to Europe and doing the summer festival tour. So they'll make enough money in 3 months to live off for the rest of the year. That happens. It's actually quite common. So I would like to, how are we doing on time? Did we want to divide this into 45 and 45, or? Okay, maybe what I should do is ask you if you have any questions about anything you've heard so far. Yes, here would be your chance. No? Not a single question? Okay, here's something else I want to tell you about. People who are curious end up learning more. And the more you learn, the better you are able to make your way in this world. I know everybody has already told me, oh, Estonians are shy. They'll be really shy to ask questions, yes? Okay, I understand that. I appreciate that. And if you don't want to ask a question now, that's your choice. But before you leave here today, I want you to ask a question. I want each of you to ask a question. So we'll save your questions for the second part of this. I'm also going to save some very rare audio and video clips for you to help entice you to come back for this second half. Things that you have never heard before, things that are unpublished, things that I feel are extraordinary. And I'm going to share some of that with you when we resume in, what, 10 minutes? Let's do that. Let's take 10 minutes, okay? Okay, I want to start this second part by talking about one of the most important trends for me, and that is the rise of women in jazz. Women have always been playing jazz. If you go back to the 1920s, Lil Armstrong with Louis Armstrong, and so on. But they were not necessarily creators. They were interpreters. And, you know, jazz is such a macho kind of sport to begin with. It's mostly men playing it. It's mostly men in the audience. And so there was a subtle and maybe not so subtle put down that musicians used to indulge in. They would say, oh, she plays pretty good for a girl, or she plays pretty good for a woman. These days, you can't say that anymore. You can't even think about saying that. If you go to music schools now, and in the United States, I'm talking about the Berklee College of Music, New England Conservatory, the New School, North Texas State, the classes are filled with women. Years past, if a woman played jazz, it's generally piano players, flutists, maybe harp, or singers. And these days, women are playing everything in the band. Everything. It's not a novelty anymore. I'll give you an example. One of my very favorite drummers these days is named Terry Lynn Carrington. I wonder if anybody knows that name. No? When you get out of here, or tonight, or whenever, look her up. There's some incredible clips on YouTube of her playing. She's an extraordinarily strong player. And she's actually from Boston, which is where Tony Williams was from and Alan Dawson were from. She started playing professionally at the age of 12 or 13, and she's grown and grown and grown. By now, I guess she's around 50. She won a Grammy 2 years ago.
Was she the one who made the CD with women only? Oh, right, women, yeah.
She's very strong. So here's a follow-up to that. No, this is from, I'm going to play you something from that Women Only CD. You'll hear the first voice singing a cappella is Gretchen Parlato, another one of the newest names these days in jazz. She sings, and this is sort of the new style, she sings really light. It's kind of ethereal, like she's singing right into your ear. Perfect diction. And then the band kicks in to show you that swing is not passé by any stretch. They're burning on this. Ingrid Jensen is the trumpet soloist. And the song, I hope everybody will recognize this song.
These are words that go together well. I love you, I love you, I love you.
Okay, so it's no longer she plays pretty good for a woman. She plays pretty good, period. Again, you're going to see more and more women on the bandstand. You're going to see more and more women as headliners, not just as singers, but as instrumentalists. It's one of the most encouraging things because I tend to believe that one of the reasons jazz was always only 3% of the marketplace is because it only appealed to men. Women didn't have anything to identify with. First of all, it's hard enough to listen to jazz because you're talking about a form of abstraction. You take a melody and you do theme and variations and you go further and further away from the melody. It's hard for people to hold on to that. But if you see young girls looking on the bandstand and they see somebody who sort of looks like them up there playing a saxophone or behind the drums or leading the whole show, it's inspirational, and I think more and more people are starting to follow in their tracks. So Terry Lynn was one of the real pioneers in the modern age, and I think she's achieving great success, not just as a drummer and a band leader, she's a wonderful producer. And one thing Terry still does, and this leads to my second point about what's happening today, is that she doesn't just stay focused on jazz. She deals with R&B and funk and hip hop. She is a producer, and a lot of bands come to her for advice and to go into the studio, and she delivers the product with them. So that's the other big point, is that modern day jazz musicians, not all of them, but more and more of them, are no longer focusing solely on jazz. In my day, again, back in the, during Australopithecus, we used to be very purist about it. You were either playing jazz or you were selling out. That was how harsh we were about being judgmental. These days, people aren't nearly as judgmental. And in fact, more often than not, if you were to talk to young musicians and ask them what they're listening to, it's probably not going to be jazz. They're listening to vernacular music of the day. They're listening to soul and R&B and funk and hip hop and rock and everything else. Some are listening to classical music. So I think this widening of the lens, this zooming out and having a deeper appreciation for everything else in the world of music is a defining characteristic of our time. And you're starting to hear that more and more in the music that people are recording and releasing. I'll give you some examples. I mentioned the name Robert Glasper a little bit ago, but I didn't see any nods or names or people seeming to recognize it. I'll play you a clip by Robert Glasper from a record he put out about 1.5 years ago. He's performing a tune that's well known to many jazz artists because it's written by Mongo Santamaria. It's called Afro Blue. John Coltrane did a very important, actually many great versions of it. Abbey Lincoln sang a great version of it. It's become a standard in the jazz world. So Robert Glasper records Afro Blue, but he doesn't do it in a jazz style. He does it in a style that you would recognize today as vernacular music. First of all, he's got Chris Dave playing drums with him, and he knows all the beats. He knows what's happening today, what young people want to hear. And then he asked Erykah Badu to come and sing it with him. So this is Afro Blue from Robert Glasper. Listen how they pumped up the bass and the bass drum. You can feel it in the club.
You shame on the land my soul is from.
I'd love to play the whole thing, but you get the idea. There's certain things that never go out of style. Singing and playing in tune, and the groove. The groove never goes out of style. It might change a little bit over time, and what people think is hip might change, but there's something that makes people nod their head. The other thing that I think is worth noting about this is that the audience has changed over time. Anybody who knows something about the history of jazz is well aware that this music is created by African Americans in the United States. It doesn't mean exclusively. Everybody contributed in some way or another, but it's a music born in the United States by American blacks. So they are the creators of this music. I know this sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many whites think that whites created it. And that speaks to the whole process of appropriation and the way popular culture takes something and absorbs it and makes it theirs. So, for example, African American artists, band leaders like Fletcher Henderson or Jimmy Lunsford or Count Basie, they created the swing style, but who became the king of swing? It was Benny Goodman, a white band leader. Part of that has to do with who had access to production, to the means of production, and who was the majority population that was that consumed this music. The reason I bring this up is that for years now, for I'd say the last 40 years or so, African Americans have turned away from jazz. And so for decades now, if you go to a jazz club, you'll see mostly whites. Whites is who paid for the music. And black musicians would always be lamenting, where are our people? How come they don't come out anymore? Music like Robert Glasper is playing is starting to bring young blacks back into the room, back to the clubs, back to the concerts. It's encouraging on a number of levels. First of all, we need as many people as possible to help support the music. But secondly, it's a way to reclaim one's own culture. And I think blacks love when they see blacks out in the audience. Maybe not every time in every case, but I'm saying that it's a sign of health, that the music is healthy once again, that it's not just monochromatic. So that's a big deal. That's a very big deal. So there are a number of other things we can talk about in terms of trends, but for the remaining time, what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you a detective story. Anybody like detective stories? Yes, everybody likes them. And this is a story about treasure lost and found. For this, I will ask us to turn off because of rights issues, intellectual property. NBC you have to get them to sign off on it. But all that aside, the great discovery happens in 2004, at the end of 2004. We started working on the Voice of America collection. And we have about 50,000 reels of tape in the VOA collection. And it was going to take us a good, 3 or 4 years to get through them. So each week they'd bring us a new batch of tapes. I would look at them and I'd say, okay, this is what we're doing. I'd assign them. I was the manager of the studio, so I would assign people to do something. Then I saw one day they brought us 8 reels of tape that said Carnegie Hall Jazz, 1957. I thought, oh, well, this could be interesting. That's a good year for jazz. It's a really good year for jazz. And I looked on the back of one of the tapes, written in pencil, handwritten, it said T. Monk, with some song titles. I hope everybody here has heard the name Thelonious Monk. Please tell me you've heard Thelonious Monk. Thank you. I'm a huge Monk fan. I mean, and I think I know almost everything he's issued. But this struck me as unusual, and I thought, well, maybe this is some unpublished Monk. This could be interesting. So I put the tape on the machine to play it back and to digitize it. And the first track is a piece called Monk's Mood. And I heard the saxophone enter, and it was John Coltrane. Now, I know Coltrane's sound intimately, I mean, inside out. Am I the only John Coltrane fan here? Is there anybody else? In the back, you like John Coltrane. Maybe we're the only ones. Nobody else likes John Coltrane? All right. John Coltrane's like, big deal for me, and as is Monk. But I'm thinking, Coltrane, Monk? Coltrane, Monk? I had never heard this before, certainly not live. They had made 3 songs together in the studio, only 3. This is a band that had worked for about 6 to 8 months at the 5 Spot in New York, but because Monk was recording for Riverside and Coltrane was recording for Prestige, they never recorded together except for those 3 songs. And that's all we had of one of the greatest groups ever in jazz. Then a few years later, actually about 20 years later, they found a bootleg recording recorded on literally a tape recorder on a table at the 5 Spot. It sounds awful, low fidelity. But it's so rare, and that group was so important, the Blue Note issued it. And some people actually bought it. I can't even listen to it. It's really rough. And that's all we had. That's all anybody knew. So I'm thinking, well, maybe have I missed something? So I called up Lewis Porter, who teaches at Rutgers University, and he's the preeminent Coltrane scholar. I said, Lewis, has anybody released this in any form? Have you even heard it? He said, you found it? This is the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail of recordings for Monk and Coltrane scholars. Everybody knew that, some people knew that Voice of America was there that night at the concert. It's at Carnegie Hall in November of '57. They knew VOA was there, but nobody had found the tape. Lewis Porter had actually asked us if we had the tape. He had asked us like 15 years earlier. And we said, what's the name of it? He says, I don't know, it's Monk and Coltrane. Well, here's a basic archival principle. These tapes had not been cataloged. So you couldn't do keyword search or name search for Monk or Coltrane. You had to know the title of the tape, which was Carnegie Hall Jazz, 1957. Because those 50,000 reels are all in the basement of the library building on these shelves in alphabetical order. So if you know you're looking for Carnegie Hall Jazz, you just go to the C's and pull out the tape. But there's no way to go through 50,000 reels looking for Monk and Coltrane. It just doesn't make sense. So that's why nobody had found it. The tape was recorded live in 1957. It sat on a shelf for 47 years. No, it had not even been played. And you can tell it because of the wind on the reel, perfectly flat. So it goes through the machine, across the record head, goes onto a take-up reel, and then winds flat and even. And nobody had played it since. We were very fortunate that there were no problems with the tape. We were especially fortunate that the best of the Voice of America engineers was there that night. They had some really bad engineers, and a lot of their recordings sound awful. Just bad balance and distortion and whatever. But they had a really good engineer that night. It's a mono recording, but it's pristine, beautiful sounding record. So what happened was I tried to tell the world about this. You know, I'm saying, hey, Monk, Coltrane, you know? And nobody not a peep out of anybody. We actually issued a press release telling the world, hey, we found this tape, Monk Coltrane, extremely rare. Nothing, not a single call. And then Ben Ratliff, about 3 weeks later, wrote to me and said he's writing a book on Coltrane. He heard we found this tape. Could he listen to it? Please come down. We spent the day. He listened to the recordings. It's actually 2 sets. There's an 8 o'clock show and a midnight show. He listened to both of them 3 times. And then he went back to New York and wrote the story for the New York Times. And the morning that story appeared, our phones were ringing off the hook. The whole world was crawling, asking, how can we issue this recording? They want it. The first or second person who called was a man named Alan Bergman, who is the attorney for the Monk estate. He says, we need to have a copy of this. Ordinarily, I would say, well, you need permission from the estate, but they are the estate. So I sent him a CD, and then he shopped that around in New York to various labels. Every label wanted it, and Blue Note made the best offer. So Blue Note got permission to use the tape. They also got permission to use Coltrane's name on the cover. Originally, it was just the Thelonious Monk Quartet. That's what it was billed as that night. But Coltrane is such a big name these days that they call it Thelonious Monk Quartet with John Coltrane at Carnegie Hall. This is it. This is the disc that was issued in November of 2005. It just exploded, not just in the United States, but around the world. I couldn't believe how much publicity this got. And for a straight-ahead instrumental jazz recording, it sold upwards of 600,000 copies, which for jazz, I mean, for anything that's not Kenny G, that's big numbers. So, has anybody heard this? You've never heard this. Oh, you have homework to do. This is your homework. Thelonious Monk Quartet with John Coltrane at Carnegie Hall. This is the discovery that, I mean, it's also, I wrote a piece in the liner notes for it, in the booklet. This was a big deal. It got me known all over the world. And I want to play you, should I play you something from it? Do we have time? Yes. Yeah, okay. Let's hear a little bit of it. Are there any saxophonists in the room? Okay, get ready. Strap yourselves in. Let's find, here we go. This is a piece called Baya. It's a Monk composition. Would love to play more, but it's available. It's out there. So the CD was released, it exploded, sold a lot of money, got a lot of recognition. I got a call from Thelonious Monk's son, T.S. Monk, who expressed his great appreciation for having found the tapes. And I know he made a lot of money on it. He says, don't worry, we're going to send you a little something to express our appreciation for finding it. I'm still waiting. 7 years later. Okay, I have one last clip I'd like to share with you, a video, but I'm not going to show it until you start asking questions. So you're being held hostage now. I really need to get your feedback or something that you're curious about. You've been listening, you've been very patient, and I can see in your eyes that you're listening, but I would love to hear some questions from here. So who has a question? Yes, thank you. The brave one begins.
How much and how do you listen to music nowadays, in the past, and how it has changed?
Yeah, because we're talking about change, and I've changed personally too. I used to consume music all the time. I mean, I'd go into work and be doing it for 8 hours, and then I'd come home and do it for another 4 or 5 hours, and then I'd eat it and breathe it and consume it. I can't do that as much anymore. So often I go to work, and I'm all music all the time at work, and then I go home and I read. I'll go take a walk. or I'll watch movies. I need some kind of balance. But that's just me personally at this stage of my life. If there's something I really love, yes, I'm listening to it all the time. And certain people I'll discover and keep at it. Like when I first started getting interested in João Gilberto, I couldn't get enough of it. And I would listen to him all day long. You know, every break, on my lunch hour, coming home from work, while at home. I can't do that anymore. I need some kind of balance. But I spent probably 40 years doing that all-consuming kind of stuff. And now I regiment it. There's work, there's listening to things from my radio show, there's listening things when I'm preparing an article, and that's it. And then I need to like breathe a little bit. So that's me.
Did you used to have music on while you were doing other things?
It depends what other things. What was the example?
Washing up, doing the dishes.
Oh, yeah, sure. I tend to find when I'm listening to vocals, it can be a little distracting because I'm zeroing in on the lyrics, whereas instrumental music is sometimes a little easier for me to be doing other things. For example, if I'm reading, I can't read with lyrics happening in my ear. It just doesn't work for me. At least that's the way it is now. So who else has a question? Yes?
This is a funny question. You said you started out as a singer. Do you still sing or do you ever
No.
play an instrument?
I do not sing.
But do you ever play an instrument?
I played bass very briefly, not very well. No, I was a singer, and that was it. And I did that for 12 years, and then I became a recording engineer for 25 years. And I did that, and I've had some sort of issues with my voice, so I can't sing anymore. It's just, I don't want to go into it, but it's just, let's just say that those were important years as a singer, because you really understand when you're on stage and you're singing to people and you see their reaction. That tells you a lot about what works and what doesn't work, and how you're reaching people and what they're feeling, because they express it in their face. Who else? Yes?
Let's say you have a blind test and you have 6 different jazz bands in front of you, and they're all from different parts of the world. Could you and they're all playing one jazz standard. Could you tell which band is from which part of the world? Which is supposed to be?
It's an interesting question, because it gets at the fact that music is a language, and although we may all speak a similar language, sometimes you can hear an accent in the way English, for example, may be spoken. You can sometimes get a sense, and if you recognize some individual's style, you can zero in that way. But I think that because everybody is exposed to similar kinds of repertoire and the same classic recordings, so you can go anywhere around the world and hear people playing in a New York style. On the other hand, there are certain things. I mean, we used to say there were regional differences. So, for example, people in New York might play on the front part of the beat. Somebody in Detroit may play on the back part, and so, you know, or vice versa. All of that's gone because we all have access to everything now. You're not informed only by your community. Everybody has access. And that means it becomes universal. So yes, I guess you could say there may be some kind of Nordic style or Nordic approach to sound. Not so much to the notes being played, but the way notes are shaped, or the way people might use legato in certain kind of phrases, or the way people might utilize tone in a certain way without vibrato, for example. But the ability to nail location by sound is getting more and more difficult because everything becomes universal. Does that make sense? Okay, who else? Yes?
But
I'm sorry, what?
But from where do you discover new music? What is it, radio or YouTube?
Well, because I do radio, I've been doing radio for a long time, and because I write for these magazines, I'm on all the mailing lists for a lot of different companies. Certainly in the United States, I've got that covered. I'm getting more and more things from Europe, but not everything. That's why when I come to Estonia, I want to hear Estonian musicians. So if you're a musician, if you're a good musician who has a CD, I want to hear it. So hint, hint. I'd love to take some stuff back with me and pour it over. She says I've got 5 minutes. We have time. Oh, we have 0 minutes. Okay. We have time for one last question. One last question. Yes. Here.
Have you ever gotten into like some of the early 70s UK jazz rock, avant-garde
Sure.
stuff?
The prog stuff. Yeah, I went through many different phases, checking out as much as I could. I would travel because like I fell in love with Indonesian gamelan music. So I just went to I went to Java and I went to Bali so I could hear these bands. I fell in love with samba, so I went to Brazil for Carnival. Now I can't go back to the 70s to listen to King Crimson, but I can listen to the recordings. A colleague of mine who I just connected with again after 3 years, we re-met in Tallinn. He's going to be working on a book on that subject. So we were just talking on and on about prog rock from the 70s into the 80s.
What are some of the favorites of yours?
Well, these days, I can't say that much about the favorites because for me, that stuff is so rooted in its time. I mean, at that time, if you're talking about fusion, it's not so much, I mean, I was a big Mahavishnu fan. So Mahavishnu Orchestra was a big thing for me. When I interviewed John McLaughlin, we talked about that a lot. All those initial bands in that first wave, whether it's Mahavishnu or Larry Coryell or Dreams or any of those bands. I'm a big Alan Holdsworth fan, for example. Soft Machine was a big band for me in those days. I even liked Yes. I don't know if you consider them prog rock, but yeah. Yeah, all of those bands had something to say. I was a fan of Brian Eno, and I was a fan of, what's the guy's name? I'll think of it in a second. But yes, it's all there. My guess is in another 10 years, I'll go back and re-listen to it again and discover new things, because that's what it's about. It's about discovery. I wish I had time to play you the video, but maybe next time I come back. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thank you.